can remember there's a second one to ask as well, all right? But remember where we left off last week at Genesis 14, Abram has led a rescue mission to save Lot, and in that rescue mission, Abram and his group kill a bunch of people. And the text says that when Abram got back from the slaughter, so there was a lot of bloodshed there. And it ends, there's that high, beautiful moment in which Abram and Melchizedek meet each other. They honor one another. And I think there's such a fascinating picture there of how, though we don't deserve it, God will still give honor to us. And of course, it's required of us to give the proper honor back to him. That chapter ends on such a wonderful note. And then look at how chapter 15 begins, right? So you've just had this great rescue mission. You saved Lot. Of course, you and Lot still aren't together again, but you have the respect of the king of Sodom. You have been able to pay back the men who went on the rescue mission with you. It was all a success. And verse 15, after these things, the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision, saying, fear not. David Guzik and Henry Morris, and I just call them JFB, it's another group of scholars, they mentioned that what Abram is probably afraid of is retaliation. I mean, he just went up and killed a bunch of people. And it's likely that Abram, in his knowing how human beings work, he doesn't know that those tribes are going to reinforce and come back and get a little vengeance. There's a novel called Peace Like a River that came out, it's probably been a decade ago now. And the very beginning of that story, there's this group of boys, they do something they shouldn't have done, and the father of the family who's been messed with, he ups the ante a little bit. And there's a lot of talk at the beginning of the novel about when human beings get into conflicts, you always have this thing called escalation that could happen, right? You do this, so I'm going to do this, and now I'm going to do this. And that whole story gets rolling because after the father retaliates, the group comes back again, and then the ante gets upped even farther and someone gets killed, and then that sets everything in motion. So some of these scholars have said this is possibly what Abram was afraid about. What if these tribes roll up in here again, right? That's very possible that he's afraid of that. But let's see what the context shows us. It's possible that he's maybe afraid of something else or afraid of both of these things. Look what he says here. Fear not, Abram. I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. I am your protector. I am your benefactor, right? And I am this thing. Verse 2, and Abram said, Lord God, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless? It's very likely that Abram is still afraid that he does not have an heir to his name, that his line is going to end with his death. And that's a valid fear, right? To not have anyone to carry on the name. And we'll go back to the text here in a minute, but the question I have for all of you, just to at least think about, but if you have something to answer, what is something that causes you to fear? What makes you scared? What are you afraid of?
Physically?
Anything.
Snakes.
Snakes. Indiana Jones is afraid of snakes.
Yeah.
That's a valid fear. Snakes. What else? What are we afraid of? Cancer. Yeah. Loss of employment. Okay.
Something at the house always breaking, we can't fix it. And having to ask Dad.
Perfect. Perfect.
And I have to wait in line after my sister, so we don't fall.
That's great. That's really good. Yeah, please don't break. Yeah. I think, yeah. I think all parents are, man, there goes my child, right? And they're probably still thinking about that. Yeah, he's 40, but man, he's an idiot, right? As the time, one of the first times I ever traveled up here to Seebeck, I stopped at a gas station, filled up with gas, went into the restroom, headed on. And about a day later, maybe I might have the timeline wrong, a state trooper or a sheriff shows up at my father's house in North Carolina and says, we have, your car. Is this your car? I says, yeah, it is. They had a photo of it. I said, well, the driver of this car didn't pay for gas. Do you think, and I remember my dad telling me the officer asked him, basically this is what he asked him, do you think this was an act of deviancy, like this is what this guy does? And my dad's response was, I think it was an act of stupidity. And I remember Dad calling me and saying, you got to drive back down, I don't know, it's Fancy Gap maybe, like you got to go back and pay that bill. I was like, yes, sir, no problem. So, I mean, we're just not too bright. What else makes you afraid?
Just the unknown. Kind of the future, I guess.
Yeah, what's out there? Yeah, right? A lot of things to terrify us. Let's look at briefly Psalm chapter 56. When Pastor mentioned this psalm, I think it was last Sunday. He might have mentioned it again on Wednesday. I love that when things happen where he and I don't sit down and talk and plan, hey, what are you talking about? What are we doing? It's just neat to see how the scripture aligns. Psalm chapter 56, and this was a psalm that Pastor looked at recently. One thing that should cause us to be afraid is God. Lest we forget, he is the creator of everything. And he could just, you're done. And yet he doesn't. Look what the psalmist says here. Be merciful unto me, O God, for man would swallow me up. He fighting daily oppresseth me. We should also be afraid of our fellow man. Human beings are really good at being terrible to one another. Mine enemies would daily swallow me up, for they be many that fight against me. O thou most high, what time I am afraid, I will trust in thee. In God I will praise his word. In God I have put my trust. I will not fear what flesh can do unto me. Every day they wrest my words. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They gather themselves together. They hide themselves. They mark my steps when they wait for my soul. Shall they escape by iniquity? In thine anger cast down the people, O God. Thou tellest me my wanderings. Put thou my tears into thy bottle. Are they not in thy book? When I cry unto thee, then shall mine enemies turn back. This I know, for God is for me. In God I will praise his word. In the Lord will I praise his word. In God have I put my trust. I will not be afraid what man can do unto me, and not afraid what man, even under the influence of the fallen ones. Right? There is a spiritual enemy who is out to destroy us. 12, thy vows are upon me. O God, I will render praises unto thee, for thou hast delivered my soul from death. Right? One of the great fears all human beings have is death. Will not thou deliver my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of the living? And of course, the answer is yes, he will. All right, so we can come back to Genesis 15. Think of all these things that we fear. Psalm 56 is a chapter that speaks to some of those fears. We know elsewhere in Scripture where we are told that God has given us a spirit not of fear, but of sound mind. We are told many times when Jesus speaks to the disciples, many times he starts with fear not. And in the Old Testament, God shows up and tells Abram, fear not. So whether Abram's afraid of retaliation, whether Abram's afraid of, man, I don't have an heir, and my family name is going to die with me out here in this land, it's likely too that when God shows up, it causes Abram a little bit of fear. I mean, think of this, a vision of God. What might that look like? It'd be pretty terrifying, right? This all-powerful being. And of course, God comes and says, fear not. And later it will say that the fear of God is the beginning of knowledge and wisdom, right? There, we ought to have that reverential awe of God. And one reason we ought not to fear man is that the fear of man enslaves. It does not free us at all. Of course, it's also to consider that these things that cause us to be afraid, there are things we can do oftentimes to deal with them, right? But can we remove, or should we remove, all the things that terrorize us? When we make safety and ease the mission of our life, then we're trying to live in a way that ignores reality. Right? We live in a fallen world. There are going to be things that terrorize us, that cause us to fear. And God doesn't always take those things away. He usually leaves them there. And I say that specifically because what he's going to promise to Abram, he's already promised to Abram, I will give you an heir. But even after this chapter, when God promises him an heir, Sarah's not pregnant the next day. Abram is waiting for years for God's promise to be fulfilled. And I'm sure that it's caused him a great deal of fear, right? Think of when the Jews went into Canaan. They don't go into Canaan the first time because they were afraid, right? These guys are massive. They're going to destroy us. And God says, I will fight for you. I'll fight with you. But he doesn't remove those giants. And when Joshua brings the Jews in, they still have to go to Jericho, and they have to go to Bethel, and they have to go to Ai. There are still these things that God causes us to face, right? God has still not removed sin yet. And who knows all the things in your life that you're dealing with that you're like, God, when are you going to take care of this thing? It's causing me a great deal of fear and anxiety. And maybe God's will is to not remove it, but for us to trust him more greatly through the situation. We know that Jesus endured something that would cause us all fear. If we knew tomorrow we were going to be tortured, stripped naked, and paraded in front of Princeton and crucified, I think that would cause all of us to lose some sleep. We know that Christ went to Gethsemane and said, if it be your will, let this cup pass from me. And not only the fear of what that was going to be, Christ knew spiritually what that meant. He knew that he was going to take on the sins of the world. He knew that he was going to enter into the land of evil. He was going to go there on our behalf. And yet he went there for us. So sometimes trying to remove all the things that fear us, we're playing a game that doesn't even exist. All right? And also, some of the enemies of God who are afraid of him, their response is, we'll just act as if it's not there. Right? But acting as if God doesn't exist doesn't mean he doesn't exist. Just like, and you've heard people in your life, something bad happens, their initial reaction is, it's okay. Right? We're going to shower this with positivity. We can be positive, but don't act as if the bad thing didn't happen. Right? You really broke something. You really are bad at this thing and need to get better. You really have cancer and it's not going away. You really don't have a job right now. And sometimes this positivity becomes a God in and of itself. And it's just a dangerous game of pretend. Also, anyways, let's move on here. So God comes in and says, fear not, Abram, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. Abram says, God, when are you going to give me an heir? And he says, I go childless. The steward in my house is this Eliezer of Damascus, one who is not a Jew. And what would happen in that time, if you owned servants, and Abram had all of these servants, the servant that was considered your most trusted confidant, we think of Joseph when he's in the house of Potiphar, the servant who was your most trusted confidant and had the highest amount of responsibility next to you, if they had a child and you as the primary owner did not, you could adopt that child and bring them into your family. This was common practice even into the time of the Roman Empire. If you read Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, he will mention Marcus Aurelius was adopted by another Roman authority. They would bring people in if they didn't have a child of their own. They would bring them in to have an heir, and I can give you training, and I can give you education, and give you those things you need. Of course, this is the Star Wars story, right? Obi-Wan brings in Luke. Like, I will essentially adopt you and take care of you, right? So Abram could have done this, and yet Abram wants to have a child of his own. Verse 3, and Abram said, behold, to me thou hast given no seed, and lo, one born in my house is mine heir. And behold, the word of the Lord, and Henry Morris points out, this is the very first time in the Bible the word is used. The word of the Lord came unto him, saying, this shall not be thine heir, but he that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir. And he brought him forth abroad and said, look now toward heaven and tell the stars, or count the stars. And a side note, that's a really good book. If you ever want to check out an easy read, it's considered children's literature, but it's called Count the Stars. That's a fascinating story of a little Jewish girl who's trying to escape the Nazis, but it's about that big. You could read it in a weekend. Great story. But anyways, it is the title of that book, Count the Stars, comes from this passage because the promise God made to Abram, I will give you a line of descendants that you can't even count. You will not be wiped off the face of the earth. And that's what, anyways, he says here, tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, so shall thy seed be. And he, Abram, believed in the Lord, and he, God, counted it to him for righteousness. And here's the faith, right? And the New Testament will tell us that this was accounted to Abram for righteousness. We see all the works that Abram has already done, and we know the big work that's coming, right? Even a group of small boys yesterday at basketball practice asked him, can you tell me something about Abram or Abraham? And a couple of them said, wasn't he supposed to sacrifice his kid? Like that's a big moment. But prior to that, Abram is already exercising, he is trusting God, right? That faith. And many scholars have noted that this is a classic passage to point to, that salvation is by grace through faith, not of works, lest any man should boast. And if anyone could boast of their works, Abram could boast. Abraham could boast because he was willing to sacrifice his son. And of course, as a New Testament parallel, Paul could boast because Paul satisfied all of the law of the Jewish law. And yet here's this faith that Abram is putting forth. And God says, it is imputed unto you for righteousness. Verse 7, and he said unto him, I am the Lord that brought thee out of Ur of the Chaldees to give thee this land to inherit. We can think now, jump ahead to the book of Exodus, and in the Old Testament, first 5 books of the Old Testament, the number of times that God tells the Jews, I am the one who brought you out of Egypt, right? And it's just a great reminder of where God brings us from, right? Think of all of us in this room today, where we are now, yes, because of efforts that we have made, right, to a greater or lesser degree, but because of the will of God and the grace of God and the mercy of God in our life. And of course, the salvation that we've been saved from, the death that we've been saved from through salvation. It's good to be reminded of, we did not do that ourselves. And it might seem like such a little thing, but it is those little things that are so important, because throughout time, and especially now, there's a massive idea out there. It is just rolling like an ocean that you can save yourself. You can be your own God, or salvation is in something else. And here God's telling Abram, I will give you a seed, and I'm the one who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give thee this land to inherit it. Verse 8, and he said, Lord God, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it? And he said unto him, take me an heifer of 3 years old, and a she-goat of 3 years old, and a ram of 3 years old, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. When Jews brought a sacrifice later in the Old Testament, they were usually required to bring just one thing. And some scholars have noted that Abram bringing all of these animals as a sacrifice also was a foreshadow of the Christ's sacrifice, because Christ was all the sacrifices. He was everything. And his death on the cross satisfied what for an eternity of sacrifices that we would make of animals or whatever would not ultimately satisfy the law. And so this is a foreshadow of God saying, bring me all of the sacrifices for what we're going to do here, right? And we're going to see that Christ will take care of that on the cross. But he tells him to bring all these animals. Verse 10, and he, Abram, took unto him all of these animals, and these were all the animals that were allowed to be brought as a sacrifice, and divided them in the midst. So in the midst of wherever he was supposed to meet God, probably in the midst of his own territory, he cuts these animals in half. And in the ancient world, if you were going to make an agreement with someone, it was common practice to take an animal, whatever was your highest animal that you had, and we're going to kill this thing. And we're going to divide it, and we're going to set it out, and then the two of us will walk side by side through the body parts of this animal. We have made a covenant here. Thankfully, we don't go to do that when we sign for a house, right? Bring your dog, bring your cat, bring your neighbor's dog, whatever. We'll cut that thing up in the lobby of First Community and walk through it, right? But we do something probably a little riskier. We promise money, right? Money with compounding interest by the second, right? When we sign a contract for a job, That company promises, we will pay you X amount as long as you fulfill. And if you do not, then we don't have to pay. You might even owe us. All those in the room who are in college or on the verge of college and getting scholarships, right? Scholarships are, if you perform A, B, C, D, right, you will get money. If not, we don't have to pay. And if you don't, you might owe us. And if you transfer, right? So we're still giving that thing that is of most value to us, right? Even though it's depreciating in value at the same time, ironically enough. But in the ancient world, aside from your own flesh and blood, which we're going to see, it's so fascinating, we're going to see that in a little bit, the most valuable thing you had was your livestock. So if you want to make a serious covenant, let's see some real skin in the game. What do you got? So Abram brings, and I'm sure he brought the best of what he had. And he brings them all, and he divides them up, and he lays them out on the ground. And I love this next detail, and this is where we're going to end up stopping today. He took unto him all these and divided them in the midst, and laid each piece one against another. But the birds divided he not. And when the fowls came down upon the carcasses, Abram drove them away. One of the greatest fears some of us have is the fear of silence. It's why one of the most deadly argumentative tactics one person can employ is the silent treatment, right? We fear silence and we fear waiting. In fact, to reference the film Spy Game, Robert Redford plays this like top CIA, FBI agent character, and he's recounting this story. And all the things he's talking about, you're thinking, man, these are amazing that people can do this. And then he tells the people he's being interrogated by, he said, you know what the hardest thing is this job is? The waiting. We just have to sit still, right? Think of how awkward it's about to get if I just stop talking and we just sit here. What are we going to start to fidget with or mess with, right? We've probably noticed our own human behavior. You've probably watched other humans. I see it all the time in the hallways of school or in the classroom. The second there's downtime or even the hint of downtime, what do we most of us do now? We reach for our phone, right? Because waiting and being in silence is extremely difficult. Abram makes this massive sacrifice. And you would think, I would think at least, God would then just come right down. Bam. But what the text tells us is that after he makes this huge sacrifice, okay, God, I'm here, an amount of time passes, so much that now the birds of carrion are able to come down and try to snatch up his sacrifice. And Abram now is exercising a little bit of work here. He's fighting these birds away. And some scholars, like David Guzik and Matthew Henry, have noted that one of the spiritual ideas here is, how many times are we in the presence of God or trying to spend time with God, and there's things that come in and distract us and take us away. And we have to exercise some diligence to say, I'm going to stay focused. I'm going to stay dialed here. I'm going to pray and ask for resilience or courage or the patience to let God speak when he's ready to speak. A former teacher of mine who is a screenwriter and a director of independent type films, he said movies are life with all the boring stuff cut out. And one of the things we're most afraid of is the boring stuff, right? But have you ever watched a really good trailer for a movie? Trailers move kind of like this, right? And you go to watch the movie, and the movie has to take its time. Like, man, this is really slow. And it is one of the reasons why in the film industry, movies move so fast now. Watch the next time you watch a movie or a TV show, pay attention to the number of times, even a reality TV show like a renovation show, watch how many times that camera cuts to something else. That creates speed, but it is known in the industry, one reason you do that is because people get bored after staring at something for more than 5 seconds. It takes a lot of discipline. And if you watch some of the older films, 50s, 60s, especially some of the older Westerns, and some modern Westerns do a really good job of this, they will give us what's called a long shot, where the camera sits way back and we can see everything and we can see the character there, and we'll watch the scene play out from a distance, but we see everything and it plays out in real time. It's quite fascinating. And even though I would not recommend from this platform anything that Quentin Tarantino makes, one of the things that has brought him great respect in the industry is he says, all right, we're going to bring the camera in close. We're just going to sit here with two people and we're not moving. And we're just going to watch these two talk, and you will be captivated and terrified. Because there's something about being patient and waiting. Think of the close relationships we have, right? We might be fast friends at one point, but life is a test of time. To give things time. And man, if Abram doesn't show us anything in his life, he is a classic example of someone who, though flawed, and we're going to see it in the next chapter, he is willing to be patient and to wait for God to do what God will do. And who of us can force God's hand anyways? And one of the things about Abram's requirement to wait, as all of us are waiting, as the book of Romans says, the earth groans waiting for God to redeem us, our requirement of waiting should remind us of two things. First, we don't control time. So just for fun, what do you think you would do? What might be a list, top 5 things you would do if you had a control of time? If you had Thanos' Infinity Stone, Time Stone, right? What would you do? Okay? Control time. Take care of daylight savings time. Boom, done. What else? If you could control time.
You would stop it at the happy times.
Stop it. Happy times. Like right now. Yeah, stop it at happy times. Great. What else? You can control time. It's within your power. What would you do?
Time travel to the happy times.
Time travel to happy times. We're going to get to that. What else would you do?
I would have Kaylee not go to college.
Aha! Right? What parents haven't thought, ooh, I freeze you right here. Just, it's great, right? Talk about the unknown. We don't know what our kids are going to do.
You could travel back and like fix something, change something.
That's right. Fix that hair, right? Why did we wear that? Why did we say that, right? It is fascinating that the desire to control time, it's been here for all time. All the time travel movies are ultimately concerned with this. We can control time. I don't care what time travel movie it is. It is all ultimate. We can go and fix something, or we can go into the future, right? Superman goes back and reverses time so that a thing didn't happen, right? These are the powers that only God possesses, right? And unless you're, well, I don't want to go too far there. Anyways, only God has that power, right? And the things that we could do with time, we might do some very good things, but usually the really good stories that explore that idea also are a warning, like it's not going to work out like you thought it could, because there's too many things that we can't account for, right? So it should remind us that we don't control time, but God does control time. He sits outside of time. He's created time for whatever his reasons are. And part of realizing the things that we cannot do, there's moments when that requires us to pray and ask for the ability to do a thing. But I don't know that any of us should pray and ask for the power to control time, but maybe the faith to be patient when we must be patient and wait, to be reminded that there's the one who does control time, and be reminded of his glory. That is a huge thing, especially today where many of the cultures, not even American, just many of the cultures around the world are, this is all about me and my glory and my time. We control really so little. And so Abram here is fighting these fowls off, fighting these birds of prey off. He's being patient because the one who does control time, he is coming down. And he's going to visit Abram in a second. We're going to end on this note right here because I don't know where else in Scripture this phrase is used to describe God. Next verse. And when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and lo, an horror of great darkness fell upon him. And we know that it's God because look at verse 13. And he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed, and he'll go on from there. Just a very fascinating passage. So we'll come back next week and we'll pick up from here and we'll see the promise that God makes to Abram, and then we'll go right into chapter 16 and see how Abram and Sarah handle it like most of us handle things that we would rather go according to our timeline. All right? Thank you.